The steam rose from the tin mug like a spirit unbound, curling against the soft gold of dawn. Frost clung to the rail of the porch, silvering the pine beyond the fence line. Somewhere in that hush of morning, a hush that wrapped around Colt Remington's ranch like an old shawl, the world breathed quiet and alone. Colt didn't speak when he stepped outside. Hadn't, in truth, spoken to anyone in near 2 years. He nodded once at the chestnut mare waiting by the water trough. She flicked her ears, knowing him better than most humans ever had. He sat in the rocker that never rocked. The boards beneath him creaked, but didn't dare splinter. His boots were scuffed, the toes worn through the shape of his steps, steady, resigned, and clean. He took his first sip, then the second. The third he left to cool. The second mug, always the second, sat beside him untouched. He didn't look at it, didn't acknowledge it, but he set it down each morning all the same, as though the ghost of someone might reach for it again. A boy, a woman, the memory of what they might have been if things had gone different. The wind came up soft, tugging the edge of his coat. He glanced out toward the pines. That's when the feeling came, like something breathing near, not quite animal, not quite prayer. It stirred his gut the way a fire stirs coals, slow, reluctant, but hot underneath. Eliza May Hartley hadn't eaten since Wednesday. The sky had gone soft blue with dusk by the time her feet reached the last fence on the road out of town. She didn't know exactly where she was going, only that she couldn't stay where she'd been. Her white dress, once fine, with lace at the cuffs, was smudged with cinders and road dust. The buttons at the back strained. She'd lost weight in days. Her hands, once used to stitching and reading, were now raw-knuckled from knocking on doors that didn't open. They said she'd ruined herself. That's what they whispered in the mercantile, in the church pews. That she'd gone walking with the banker's son and wouldn't marry when the scandal broke. Her father slapped her. Her mother locked her out. The preacher's wife offered her coin if she'd leave before Sunday. So she did. No shoes. No name. Just her, and the stretch of snow-dusted plain beyond the ridge. She remembered distantly a man with dark hair and shoulders broad as a barn beam. A man who had come into town once a season, sold peaches from his wagon, spoke little, carried himself like silence had weight. He'd looked at her once, just once, but it was different from how the others looked. He hadn't looked away when she smiled, and he hadn't looked through her either. So she walked toward that memory, toward him. The cradle stayed near the hearth, empty but not forgotten. Colt kept the fire low, even in winter. He'd grown used to cold. It made the days sharper, more honest. It burned away the noise of a world that had no use for him anymore. Once, he'd loved a girl with wheat blonde hair and the laugh of someone who trusted the world. Sarah had come to him soft and sweet, but death had come harder. Took her in childbed, took the child too, and then came the town talk. They said he'd waited too long to fetch the doctor, that he'd let her die because she couldn't birth right, that maybe he didn't want the child, after all. He hadn't defended himself, not because it was true, but because it didn't matter what they believed anymore. The only people who mattered were already buried under earth. He turned each spring with a shovel that knew the shape of his grief. He didn't cry, not once, but he hadn't spoken since the funeral. Snow began falling slow as lace from the sky when Eliza reached the last hill. Her feet had gone numb. She could no longer feel the blisters. Her fingers were mottled red and stiff, her breath coming out in pale ribbons. But she saw the chimney smoke, thin, steady, and knew it was the place. One lantern glowed faint in the barn. She crossed the frozen ground, her knees trembling, vision stuttering at the edges. Her body wanted to give out, but something stronger pulled her forward. She made it to the porch and sank, not in collapse, but in decision. She knelt, not like a beggar, not like a bride, but like someone placing her last ounce of dignity in front of a door and saying, "Do what you will, but I came honest." Her hair clung to her cheeks in dark, wet ropes. Her lips cracked open once, and she whispered, "Please." Then she waited. Inside, Colt heard the whisper through the grain of the wood. He thought at first it was the wind, but the horses weren't restless. The dogs didn't bark. It was quieter than that. He opened the door slow. The hinges groaned like an old man's prayer. There she was. A girl. No, a woman. Her eyes looked older than her skin. Her body shook, but her back was straight. She was kneeling in his snow. He didn't move for a long while. She didn't plead, didn't explain. She simply looked up. "I heard you don't lie," she said. Colt blinked. The first voice he'd heard in his home in months wasn't his own. He stepped aside. "Inside," he said. She stood, but stumbled. He caught her before she fell, arms around her waist, so gently it was like cradling frost itself. He lifted her with no struggle. She weighed less than the sacks of oats he hauled, and brought her in. The fire lit her face in gold. She blinked hard, as if the warmth hurt her eyes. He set her down near the hearth and took a blanket from the chair, wrapped it around her shoulders. She flinched when his fingers brushed her collarbone. He said nothing. She looked at the cradle, then at him. "I didn't come to take," she said. He poured the untouched mug, the second one, into a cup and handed it to her. His hand didn't shake. She sipped once, coughed. "Thank you." He nodded once. Time passed. Minutes? Hours? Neither spoke. She sat with her hands curled around the mug like it was something sacred. Her breath came steadier now. The pink returned to her cheeks. Her eyes fluttered once or twice, but she didn't sleep. "You can put me out come morning," she murmured. Colt leaned against the beam. The fire popped softly behind her. The wind had quieted. "You got a name?" "Eliza." His voice was rough from disuse. Still, it held shape. "You." He looked into the fire a moment. Then, slow as thawed creek water, said, "Colt." The wind picked up again. But this time, it wasn't lonely. It sounded like something being returned. That night, she slept on the rug by the fire, wrapped in his old coat. She didn't ask for the bed. He didn't offer. But before he turned in, he watched her chest rise and fall and let out a breath that had been caged in him for 3 winters. He stared out the window once before sleep, and in the distant dark, beyond the pines, something unseen shifted, like fate catching its breath. Morning came soft and blue. Snow blanketed the roof like a prayer answered late. Eliza stirred, but didn't wake fully. Colt opened the door again, stood on the porch. Only this time, he poured 2 mugs of coffee and didn't leave the second untouched. He placed it beside the rocker across from his. The cradle still sat near the fire, but the air in the house had changed. Not louder, not warmer, but waiting, now, for something worth staying for. The days that followed had no name. They moved like wind over wheat, gentle, without destination, and full of unspoken things. Eliza didn't ask to stay. Colt didn't ask her to leave. And so it was, quietly. That winter passed its judgment by watching what the two of them became when no one else was looking. She rose early, swept the hearth before the fire could die. She mended the curtains, though they barely hung. She washed the same 3 shirts he owned and laid them across the banister with care. She patched his coat sleeve and never mentioned the worn place over his heart. He brought in wood every morning, repaired the door that groaned in the wind, fixed the leaning fence post she'd mentioned only once in passing. He started placing her mug out first, not second. And when her hands cracked from cold, he left a tin of balm beside the basin, without a word. They spoke in gestures, small ones, so small you could miss them if you weren't listening with your soul. Once, when she coughed through the night, he sat up at the hearth and boiled water with pine needles until the air smelled like comfort. She saw him sleeping in the chair when she woke, his hat tipped over his face, boots still on, a blanket he must have meant for her half fallen from his lap. In the barn, she touched the mare's nose gently. The horses had taken to her, even the skittish one. When Colt saw, he said nothing, but later that evening, she found oats in a second sack, tied with a blue ribbon that hadn't been used since his wife. The town was another matter. By the second week, word had reached the general store that Colt Remington had taken in the Hartley girl, the same one who'd been seen crying in the alley behind the church with her hair loose and her pride gone. The preacher's wife told it over pie crusts. The blacksmith's daughter repeated it under breath. And at the post office, a letter meant for Colt was stamped, refused, and returned to sender. It didn't surprise him. He'd buried his good name a long time ago. But when Eliza came in from town with her eyes damp and a red mark on her wrist, something inside him bristled. She tried to hide it, sat on the porch like nothing had happened, hands folded in her lap like a schoolgirl being good. But he saw the tremble in her chin. "I can go," she whispered, "if it's making things worse." His jaw moved, but he didn't answer right away. He poured 2 mugs, handed hers to her slowly. "Cost was paid long ago," he said. "Don't run just because they look." She held the cup for a long time, then brought it to her lips. That night, he didn't sleep in the rocker. He slept on the floor beside the hearth. Snow came heavy that weekend, the kind that buries sound and makes the world feel like it's waiting on breath. The storm knocked down the chimney vent. The fire smoked until she opened the side window with frozen fingers and held it there until the draft balanced the room. Her hands turned purple at the tips, and when Colt saw, he took her fingers in his and wrapped them with his scarf. He didn't say a word. In the silence of that night, she found a box of old records. The wind howled outside like wolves who'd lost the trail, and inside, the needle found the groove. Music creaked to life, soft, warbled, but warm like honey on worn wood. She stood up, swayed a little. "Dance?" she asked, not mocking, not begging, just offering. He looked at her like she'd suggested fireflies could return in snow. Then slowly he rose. Their hands touched, awkward at first. Her left in his right, her right on his shoulder, his on the small of her back, where it barely rested. They moved like people who weren't used to being held, like it might crack them if they stepped too hard. The music faded, but they didn't let go right away. "You don't have to marry me," she whispered as they stood near the hearth. "I know that's what they think, but I didn't come for that." He studied her. "I know," he said. The next morning, she found him outside, repairing the broken front step. On Sunday, she walked to town for flour. She wore her old dress, mended as best she could, and Colt's coat over it. It swallowed her whole, but made her look untouchable. Still, it didn't stop the whispers. At the bakery, Mrs. Tillerson refused her coin. "We don't serve girls that shame themselves," she said, too loud, though no one had asked her to. Eliza turned, cheeks burning, and left without a word. But someone followed. A woman in a green bonnet. A hand gripped Eliza's wrist and yanked. "You think you can just crawl into a man's home and wear his coat like you earned it," she spat. "You think your sin gets washed off with a warm fire and silence." Eliza didn't fight, didn't raise her voice, just stared. Then another voice came, low, firm, final. "She's my wife." It echoed down the street like a church bell at midnight. Colt stepped forward, coat unbuttoned, snow in his beard, eyes dark with knowing. The woman stepped back as if slapped. "You married her," she hissed. He looked at Eliza, not at the crowd. "There was no preacher," he said, "but I said it in the firelight, and I meant it." She looked at him, wide-eyed, breath caught. He turned to the woman. "You want to cast stones, be sure you've never begged warmth from anyone." The crowd hushed. No one spoke. He took Eliza's hand, placed a simple gold band into her palm. It was old, his mother's perhaps, but polished, warm. "You never had to ask," he said. She slipped it on with trembling fingers. They walked out of town together, side by side. Back at the ranch, she stood by the window and watched him work. He chopped wood until his shirt clung to his back, and the cold clung to his breath. But he moved with ease, not anger. She stood in the cradle room, the one she never entered. It was simple, quiet. A blanket still folded at the foot of the small frame. A single wooden toy on the shelf. She set a flower in the corner. Just one. Wild, dried, forgotten in her satchel. Later that night, she brought him tea. Not coffee. Tea with dried chamomile she'd found in the back of the cupboard. He sipped surprised. Then nodded. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." She reached for his hand, not out of need, but to stay. And this time he held it. Spring waited on the ridge. Birdsong returned early, like it wanted to see if something had changed. Colt rode into town one morning. When he returned, He handed her a parcel, white muslin, finely folded. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer, just nodded at the cradle. Inside was a small blanket, soft, blue, with lace trim she'd never touched, but always dreamed of making. "I thought maybe," he started, then stopped. She pressed it to her chest, then set it in the cradle without a word. That evening, she placed 2 mugs on the porch rail. Both were warm. The sky turned rose, then indigo. Lantern light flickered through the window. Inside, he stood behind her as she embroidered a small name on the edge of the cradle blanket. Not one born yet, but one dreamed. She turned, tears in her eyes. "You're not fixing me," she whispered. "You're just making room." He nodded. "Some things don't need fixing, just believing in." She leaned her head against his chest, and for the first time, he placed a hand gently on her hair. Maybe the fire was never meant to be loud. Maybe it wasn't warmth alone that saved them, but the kind of heat that stays even when the wind rises again. The kind that waits, patient and true, for someone to kneel not in shame, but in hope, and someone else to open the door, not out of duty, but grace. Behind them, the fire glowed, and in the cradle, the blanket waited, soft, expectant, and no longer empty.